People think floods are accidents. They usually aren't. The smell of wet clay hit me before I even opened my front door. It was thick, cold, and wrong, carrying that sour mix of churned earth, diesel fuel, and soaked hay that every rancher learns to fear. I stood frozen for a heartbeat, listening. Water. Not the gentle trickle that normally wound through the creek behind my barn, but the deep, relentless rush of thousands of gallons forcing their way across ground that had been dry only yesterday. By the time my boots reached the porch steps, icy water had already swallowed the lower fence line. My horses were pacing nervously near higher ground, their ears pinned back. A herd of black Angus cattle crowded together against the western ridge, confused by a flood that had no business existing in the middle of a clear Texas morning. Then I saw it. A bright red survey stake floated past my mailbox, spinning slowly like it wanted me to notice it. I didn't know it yet, but that little piece of painted wood would eventually destroy an entire homeowners association. My name is Marcus Holloway. I'm 44 years old, a third-generation black rancher, and everything my family ever built sat on $6 million worth of rolling Texas pasture, stretching farther than most people could walk before lunch. My grandfather bought this ranch with money he earned fixing tractors after returning home from military service. My father expanded it one pasture at a time, teaching me that land isn't measured by acres. It's measured by memories, sweat, and promises kept. Every fence post had a story. Every oak tree marked another season our family refused to quit. People driving past only saw cattle and open fields. I saw birthdays, funerals, branding seasons, thunderstorms, and 3 generations of hard work rooted in soil that had never once failed us. Until that morning, water poured across my grazing fields in places it had never reached before, moving with impossible precision as though someone had pointed an invisible hose straight at my property. I climbed into my pickup and drove toward the eastern boundary where the flood seemed to begin. The tires sank into soft ground. That should have been solid. Fence posts leaned sideways under the current. Fresh tire tracks cut through the mud, far newer than the rain itself. Then I looked beyond my property line. There she stood on the brand-new overlook beside Willow Creek Estates, wearing spotless white boots that somehow hadn't collected a single speck of mud. Victoria Ashcroft, president of the HOA, folded her arms and watched my ranch disappear beneath muddy water with the calm smile of someone admiring fresh landscaping instead of a family legacy washing away. Behind her, perfectly dry sidewalks curved through expensive new homes while every drop of runoff rushed downhill toward my land. She raised a coffee cup in my direction as if we were sharing a pleasant morning. I didn't wave back. Instead, my eyes drifted once more to that red survey stake floating across the flooded pasture. Something about it didn't belong. And deep down, beneath the anger, beneath the disbelief, I felt something colder than the floodwater itself. This wasn't nature. Someone had engineered every inch of what I was looking at. The strange thing about family land is that the value printed on paper never tells the real story. Realtors liked calling my ranch a $6 million property, because that was the latest appraisal after luxury neighborhoods started swallowing everything around us. They saw development potential. Banks saw equity. Investors saw opportunity. I saw the front porch where my grandfather drank black coffee before sunrise every single morning for almost 40 years. I saw the weathered barn where my father taught me that every broken hinge deserved to be repaired before it failed completely. Even now, whenever I walked through those heavy wooden doors, I could still smell old leather saddles, cedar boards, engine oil, and fresh-cut alfalfa blending into a scent that somehow felt more like home than any house ever could. My grandfather used to say that land remembers the people who respect it. As a kid, I thought that sounded like one of those old sayings adults repeated because they enjoyed hearing themselves talk. Then I grew older. I watched droughts come and go. I watched neighbors sell to developers after one bad season. I watched shopping centers replace hay fields that had fed cattle for generations. Somehow our ranch stayed exactly what it had always been, not because we were lucky, but because every decision my family made was built around patience instead of shortcuts. My father never chased quick money. Whenever another developer arrived with polished boots and expensive watches promising unbelievable offers, he would simply smile, shake their hand, and tell them the same sentence. You cannot put a price tag on something that already belongs to your grandchildren. I did not understand those words until after he passed away. Suddenly, every fence repair became my responsibility. Every water pump, every grazing schedule, every tax payment. Every sunrise began with the sound of diesel engines warming up, and every evening ended with dusty boots sitting beside my back door. Some people think ranching is peaceful because they only see photographs taken during golden hour. They never see the early mornings when frozen pipe fittings refuse to cooperate, or the afternoons spent repairing miles of fencing beneath a blazing Texas sun. I loved every exhausting minute of it because this place had shaped every chapter of my life. Even after the luxury homes appeared beyond my eastern property line, I believed we could coexist. I waved at new neighbors. I answered questions about cattle whenever curious families stopped along the fence. Children laughed whenever calves wandered close enough to sniff tiny hands stretched through the rails. Most people appreciated having open pasture beside their subdivision because it reminded them that Texas still had room to breathe. Unfortunately, not everyone shared that feeling. As Willow Creek Estates expanded, the empty fields surrounding my ranch disappeared one construction project at a time. Concrete replaced wildflowers. Decorative ponds replaced natural creeks. Fresh asphalt covered ground that used to absorb every heavy rain without complaint. Standing on my porch that flooded morning, I looked beyond the rising water toward those perfectly identical rooftops catching the first sunlight. The silence coming from that neighborhood bothered me more than the flood itself. Nobody looked surprised. Nobody stepped outside asking what had happened. It almost felt as though everyone had expected this day except me. Then my eyes found another red survey stake drifting across the pasture, slowly turning with the current like it was quietly pointing toward an answer that had been waiting beneath the surface all along. Victoria Ashcroft had perfected the art of looking helpful while taking something that did not belong to her. She was the kind of woman who smiled through every neighborhood meeting, remembered everyone's first name, baked cookies for holiday fundraisers, and somehow left every conversation with exactly what she wanted. If you only met her once, you would probably think she was the friendliest person in Willow Creek Estates. Spend a month living beside her, and you would realize that every compliment came with a condition and every favor quietly collected interest. Her white luxury sport utility vehicle rolled through the subdivision almost every afternoon at exactly 4 o'clock, polished so perfectly that the Texas sun reflected off it like a mirror. People waved as she drove by. She waved back with practiced confidence, slowing down just enough for everyone to notice her. Around the neighborhood, she liked to say she was protecting property values. What she was really protecting was a development deal worth far more than anyone realized. My ranch interrupted that plan. Every house surrounding my eastern fence had once been open pasture connected to the same watershed that naturally carried storm runoff away from both properties. Then the developers arrived. They flattened hills, installed decorative retaining walls, widened roads, and built rows of expensive homes with perfectly trimmed lawns that looked identical from one street to the next. Victoria loved calling it progress. My father would have called it forgetting how the land actually worked. The first time she approached me was almost 3 years earlier during a neighborhood appreciation picnic. The smell of grilled burgers drifted through the air while children chased one another across freshly planted grass. She carried a folder under one arm and walked toward me with that familiar polished smile. "Marcus," she said, "your property is absolutely beautiful. Have you ever considered selling?" I smiled politely and told her the ranch was not on the market. She laughed as though I had made a charming joke instead of giving a final answer. A few weeks later, another offer arrived. Then another. Each proposal came with larger numbers printed across expensive paper, followed by promises that the community would preserve my family's legacy. Strange how people always promise to preserve something right before they replace it. When money stopped working, the letters began. Complaints about tall grass that had fed cattle for decades. Questions about fence maintenance that had not changed since my grandfather built it. Suggestions that my livestock created unpleasant views for homeowners who had knowingly purchased houses beside an active ranch. I answered every notice calmly. I kept copies of every letter. I never raised my voice because I had learned long ago that paper remembers far better than anger. The months passed, and Victoria stopped pretending this was about neighborhood appearance. During one board meeting, she looked directly at me across the room, folded her hands, and said that some properties eventually have to evolve for the good of the entire community. The room fell silent. I simply thanked the board for their time, gathered my documents, and walked out without another word. As I stepped into the evening air, I noticed a survey crew packing equipment beside the subdivision entrance. One worker loaded bright red survey stakes into the back of his truck. At the time, I barely glanced at them. Standing ankle-deep in floodwater years later, watching one of those same red stakes drift across my pasture, I realized that some plans begin long before anyone notices the first move. The flood did not begin with the storm. It began months earlier with little changes that looked harmless if you did not understand how water behaves. One construction crew widened the subdivision entrance by a few feet. Another poured fresh concrete around a decorative pond that had never existed before. Landscapers raised flower beds with truckloads of compacted soil. New retaining walls appeared behind expensive homes, each one redirecting runoff just a little farther away from Willow Creek Estates and a little closer to my side of the fence. Standing alone, none of those projects seemed important. Together, they quietly rewrote the landscape my grandfather had spent decades learning. I started noticing things because ranchers notice details that other people ignore. After a light rain, puddles lingered in places that had always drained within hours. The small creek along my eastern pasture carried more sediment than usual, leaving fresh streaks of reddish clay across the rocks. Fence posts closest to the subdivision remained damp long after the rest of the property had dried. Even the birds changed their nesting spots, avoiding trees where standing water had begun collecting beneath the branches. Every morning, I walked the fence line with a thermos of black coffee, listening to boots crunch across gravel that slowly became soft mud. The smell changed too. Instead of fresh cedar and dry grass, the air carried damp concrete and disturbed soil from nonstop construction beyond the property line. I mentioned my concerns during a county planning meeting, bringing photographs that showed how runoff patterns had shifted over the previous year. The officials thanked me politely, accepted my documents, and explained that all approved development met existing regulations. Victoria sat 3 seats away wearing another calm smile, occasionally jotting notes inside a leather binder without once looking in my direction. A week later, another letter arrived suggesting that my drainage concerns resulted from poor ranch maintenance rather than nearby construction. I filed the response with every other document already filling a cabinet in my office. Then came the final project. Contractors arrived before sunrise with excavators, dump trucks, and laser levels. From my pasture, I could hear backup alarms echoing across the valley while diesel engines hummed through the cool morning air. They worked along the shared boundary for nearly 2 weeks, building what everyone was told was an improved community drainage corridor designed to protect the new homes during heavy storms. The explanation sounded reasonable until I noticed something impossible. Every elevation marker pointed downhill toward my ranch instead of away from it. I photographed the equipment each day, including another bundle of bright red survey stakes leaning beside a trailer. Nobody stopped me because taking pictures is not against the law. Then the forecast called for the first major rain of spring. The storm itself lasted only a few hours. Thunder rolled across the hills, rain drummed against my barn roof, and lightning faded before midnight. I went to bed expecting the same creek that had handled storms for generations. Instead, before sunrise, I woke to the roar of water racing where it had never flowed before. By the time I stepped outside, the work those crews had spent months completing was finally doing exactly what it had been designed to do. For the first few days, I convinced myself that someone in county government would look at the damage and immediately recognize what had happened. I photographed every flooded pasture before sunrise, measured the water against fence posts my grandfather had installed decades earlier, and documented every muddy channel that now cut across land that had always drained naturally. The smell of soaked hay lingered for days, mixing with damp cedar and the sharp scent of diesel from pumps that ran almost non-stop as I tried to save what I could. My cattle eventually found higher ground, but several grazing sections were unusable, and fresh spring grass disappeared beneath thick layers of silt. Every hour the water remained, the ranch lost more than money. It lost another piece of a growing season that would never return. I called the county engineering office first. An inspector arrived, glanced across the flooded fields, took a few photographs, and promised someone would review the drainage permits. Weeks passed without another call. I contacted the state environmental office, believing altered waterways would surely attract attention. They acknowledged my complaint, assigned a reference number, and explained that investigations often required additional documentation. I gathered everything they requested: maps, photographs, rainfall records, property surveys. Still nothing changed. While I waited, another envelope from the Homeowners Association appeared in my mailbox. Instead of expressing concern, the letter claimed excessive standing water on my property might create maintenance issues affecting nearby homeowners. It politely suggested that I improve drainage on my own land. I read that sentence 3 times before placing the letter beside every other notice Victoria had sent over the past 3 years. My attorney shook his head after reviewing the growing stack of paperwork. He told me the evidence felt suspicious, but proving intentional misconduct against an organized homeowners association backed by developers would require far more than suspicion. Experts would be expensive. Engineers would be expensive. Litigation could last years. He asked whether I had considered accepting one of the previous purchase offers before the situation became even more difficult. I thanked him for his honesty, paid for the consultation, and drove home with the windows down because I needed fresh air more than legal advice. As I turned onto my gravel driveway, I noticed another certified letter tucked inside the mailbox. This time the Homeowners Association offered to purchase my ranch again, describing the proposal as a practical solution benefiting everyone involved. The amount looked impressive until I remembered how much larger the development would become if my property disappeared. They were not buying land. They were buying the final obstacle standing between their subdivision and unlimited expansion. That evening I sat alone inside the old barn while rainwater dripped steadily from the rafters into a metal bucket, each hollow echo filling the quiet space. I spread every document across my workbench, arranging photographs beside surveys and letters beside permit records. Nothing connected cleanly yet, but one detail refused to leave my mind. Every major change along the property line had appeared shortly after those bright red survey stakes arrived. I realized I had been looking at the damage when I should have been looking for the design behind it, because accidents leave confusion, but carefully planned decisions always leave a pattern. The answer had been sitting less than 50 yards from my office for years, hidden inside a dusty metal filing cabinet that my father refused to throw away no matter how outdated it looked. I almost ignored it that afternoon because I had already searched through every modern survey, every insurance report, and every permit I could find. Frustration has a way of making old things seem useless. Still, something about those red survey stakes kept pulling me backward instead of forward. I unlocked the cabinet and started opening drawers filled with yellowed folders labeled in my father's careful handwriting. Livestock records, fence easements, water rights, property taxes. Then I found a thick envelope marked simply Eastern Drainage. The paper inside smelled faintly of age and cedar, and as I unfolded the first large survey map across my workbench, my heartbeat slowed. This was not just another property survey. It was the original drainage study completed decades before Willow Creek Estates even existed. Every natural creek, every seasonal runoff channel, every elevation point had been carefully documented by engineers who understood that changing one part of the watershed affected everything downhill. Tucked inside the folder was another surprise. My father had handwritten notes in the margins after attending county planning meetings years earlier. He had circled several proposed drainage modifications and written one sentence beside them: "Never allow redirected runoff across the eastern pasture." Those words stopped me cold because they described exactly what had happened. I compared the old map with current satellite images on my computer. The differences were impossible to ignore. Natural drainage paths had been interrupted by retaining walls. The decorative pond collected water that originally flowed elsewhere. New grading pushed runoff toward the exact corner of my ranch that flooded first. I called an independent civil engineer named Daniel Mercer, a man who had spent 3 decades studying stormwater systems across Texas. He agreed to visit the property the following morning. We walked the eastern boundary together while the ground was still soft from the flood. Daniel carried a survey rod, a digital level, and enough quiet confidence to remind me of my father. He rarely spoke until he finished measuring. After nearly 3 hours, He stopped beside one of the remaining red survey stakes still planted near the property line. He looked from the marker to the old drainage map I had brought with me and slowly nodded. "Marcus," he said, "water does not change direction by itself. Someone changed the land." He explained that the grading, retaining structures, and drainage improvements surrounding the subdivision had systematically redirected stormwater away from the homes and concentrated it onto my property. Then he pointed toward the red stake. That marker, he explained, identified one of the control points used during construction. It was never supposed to remain there after the project ended. Suddenly, every strange detail from the past 3 years fit together like pieces of the same puzzle. The floating survey stake had not been random debris. It had been the first clue that the flood followed a blueprint instead of a storm. For the first time since the water covered my ranch, I stopped asking whether someone had caused it. The real question had become who approved the plan, who signed the documents, and who believed nobody would ever connect those forgotten red stakes to the truth. Daniel Mercer gave me the evidence, but evidence alone does not win a case. It has to tell a story that even people who have never stepped onto a ranch can understand. That realization changed everything. I stopped thinking like a frustrated property owner and started thinking like someone building a timeline one fact at a time. Every morning before sunrise, I flew a small drone over the eastern boundary, capturing high-resolution images that showed exactly where the redirected water entered my land. I placed weatherproof cameras along the fence line, each one recording around the clock without disturbing a single neighbor. Every rainfall became another chapter in a growing archive. The cameras never argued, never guessed, and never forgot. Daniel returned several times with surveying equipment, documenting elevation changes down to fractions of an inch. We compared his measurements with the original drainage study my father had saved decades earlier. The differences matched perfectly. Water that had naturally spread across open ground was now being funneled through engineered channels leading directly toward my ranch. Meanwhile, I quietly submitted public records requests for every drainage permit, grading approval, engineering revision, and inspection report connected to Willow Creek Estates. Government offices moved slowly, but paper has a way of surviving long after memories fade. Boxes of documents gradually arrived. Most contained routine paperwork, yet buried inside were revised site drawings that did not match the original plans approved years before. Someone had authorized changes after construction began. That detail mattered more than anyone realized. My attorney reviewed everything before smiling for the first time since I hired him. He told me not to contact Victoria, not to confront the board, and not to mention what we had found. If they believed I was still struggling to understand the flood, they would continue acting exactly as they always had. So I waited. The waiting was the hardest part. Every week, another homeowners association newsletter celebrated new landscaping projects and rising property values, while my eastern pasture slowly recovered from damage that should never have happened. Victoria continued driving through the neighborhood with the same confident smile, convinced the problem had become my burden instead of hers. Then another heavy rain moved through the county. This time the cameras recorded everything. Water poured through the modified drainage corridor exactly as Daniel predicted, bypassing the subdivision and racing onto my property within minutes. The drone footage captured the entire sequence from above, making the redirected flow impossible to dismiss as a coincidence. When the storm ended, we had photographs, survey measurements, engineering analysis, historical maps, weather data, and video showing the same pattern from multiple angles. My attorney organized every piece into a single timeline so simple that anyone could follow it from the first construction project to the latest flood. Looking across the conference table at the growing stack of binders, he quietly closed the final folder and said something I will never forget. "Marcus, we are no longer trying to prove that your ranch flooded. We are about to prove that someone designed it to happen." At that moment, I realized the red survey stake floating through my pasture had done exactly what it was supposed to do. It pointed me straight to the truth, and now the truth was finally ready to speak for itself. The courthouse looked nothing like the place where my grandfather settled handshake agreements or where neighbors once solved disagreements over coffee. Everything inside felt quiet, polished, and deliberate, right down to the steady ticking of the courtroom clock echoing across the wood-paneled walls. That silence worked in our favor because silence has a way of making the truth sound even louder. Victoria Ashcroft arrived surrounded by attorneys carrying polished briefcases and thick folders, greeting familiar faces with the same confident smile I had watched for years. She barely glanced in my direction, as though I were simply another inconvenience that would disappear after another meeting. I carried only one weathered leather binder that had belonged to my father. Inside were the original drainage maps, the handwritten notes he left behind, and copies of every document we had gathered since the flood. The judge listened carefully as both sides presented opening statements. The Homeowners Association insisted the flooding resulted from an unusually severe weather event and suggested my ranch had simply failed to manage natural runoff. It sounded convincing until the evidence began speaking for itself. Daniel Mercer explained the engineering analysis with calm precision, using enlarged maps to show how the original watershed had functioned before construction changed the terrain. Drone footage appeared on courtroom screens, capturing stormwater, bypassing the subdivision and flowing directly through newly graded channels toward my eastern pasture. Historical surveys followed, then modern elevation measurements, then permit revisions that no longer matched the approved drainage plans. One by one, every piece fit together exactly as we had organized it. The turning point came when county records revealed revised grading approvals issued after construction had already begun. Those revisions redirected runoff away from Willow Creek Estates, while increasing the flow entering my property. The judge paused longer than anyone expected, carefully comparing the original survey with the later engineering drawings. Then my attorney placed the final exhibit on the evidence table. It was the photograph of the bright red survey stake floating across my flooded pasture on the very first morning. Beside it appeared construction photographs showing identical stakes marking the modified drainage control points months earlier. The room became completely still. Something so ordinary had connected every stage of the story from beginning to end. During cross-examination, Victoria insisted the board simply relied upon professional recommendations and denied intentionally harming my property. Moments later, internal correspondence obtained through public records showed board discussions celebrating reduced drainage risks for the subdivision immediately after the grading revisions were approved. No message openly admitted wrongdoing, yet together they painted a picture that was impossible to ignore. The judge removed his glasses, reviewed the exhibits once more, and spoke slowly enough that every word seemed to settle across the courtroom before the next arrived. He concluded that the evidence demonstrated a deliberate pattern of decisions that substantially redirected stormwater onto my ranch while disregarding foreseeable damage. He ruled that the Homeowners Association bore legal responsibility for the resulting losses and ordered substantial financial damages. Then came the sentence nobody in the courtroom expected. Because the board had repeatedly exceeded its authority and failed its fiduciary obligations, the court ordered the association's governing board dissolved and placed under temporary court supervision pending lawful reorganization. Victoria's confident smile disappeared for the first time since I had ever known her. I did not celebrate. I simply looked toward the photograph of that red survey stake resting on the evidence screen and quietly thanked my father for teaching me that the smallest forgotten detail can sometimes carry the greatest truth. Several months after the court issued its ruling, the ranch looked the way my grandfather always believed it should. Fresh grass covered the pastures where muddy water once stood. Wildflowers returned along the creek banks as though they had simply been waiting for the land to breathe again. The air carried familiar scents that I had missed more than I realized: sun-warmed cedar, dry soil, fresh hay, and the quiet comfort that comes when nature is finally allowed to follow its own course. Every morning, I walked the eastern fence line with a cup of black coffee, listening to cattle grazing instead of rushing water. The silence no longer felt heavy. It felt earned. The court ordered the damaged drainage system corrected under independent supervision, and engineers restored the natural flow using the original watershed design preserved in my father's records. Watching the first major storm after those repairs was strangely emotional. Rain fell steadily for hours, thunder rolled across the hills, and water flowed exactly where it had flowed for generations before anyone tried to redesign the landscape for convenience. My pastures remained dry enough for healthy grazing while the creek carried the runoff safely downstream. It was the simplest proof that the truth had been there all along. The financial judgment helped repair fences, restore pasture land, replace damaged equipment, and strengthen the ranch for the future, but the money never felt like the real victory. The real victory was knowing that no family would face the same situation because someone finally held power accountable. Willow Creek Estates slowly changed as well. A newly elected board focused on transparency instead of appearances. Meeting minutes became public. Independent engineering reviews became standard before any major construction project. Homeowners who once avoided asking difficult questions began participating in decisions that affected their own neighborhood. Several families later stopped by my ranch to apologize for assuming the flooding had simply been bad luck. I appreciated the honesty because understanding usually arrives after the facts have time to speak. One quiet evening, I walked to the corner of the eastern pasture where everything had begun. Hidden beneath fresh grass, I found the faded red survey stake that had become the unexpected witness to the entire story. The paint had chipped away after months of weather, but I recognized it immediately. Instead of throwing it into the trash, I cleaned the mud from its surface and placed it inside the old barn beside my father's original drainage maps. To anyone else, it looked like a forgotten construction marker. To me, it represented the moment I stopped believing that patience meant surrender. Every generation leaves something behind. My grandfather left the land. My father left the knowledge to protect it. I hope I leave the reminder that truth does not need to shout to be heard. It only needs someone willing to preserve it until the right moment arrives. Whenever visitors ask why an old red survey stake hangs beside framed maps inside my barn, I simply smile and tell them that some of the smallest things on a ranch carry the biggest stories. Water always follows the path created for it, and so does justice. It may take longer than we hope. It may travel farther than we expect, but when the truth finally finds its course, nothing standing in its way can hold it back.